17, the 36-year-old Australian Ramesh Januzzi was going through a rather rough time in his life. He had been working as a bricklayer in recent years, but a long drawn-out struggle with illegal substances had resulted in Rames's lifestyle and health deteriorating rapidly. Drastic measures were needed and fast, but to his credit, Ramesh had the presence of mind to understand that he needed to break from his old life entirely. And so, Ramesh downloaded the Airbnb app and started browsing affordable, rentable properties around his home city of Melbourne. Ramesh didn't have a particularly large budget, so when he found a room for rent at a very reasonable price, he leapt at the chance to rent it. To Ramesh, it didn't matter that the place had a couple of less than glowing reviews. He didn't care if the atmosphere wasn't friendly. He didn't care if the plumbing looked dodgy. He just needed somewhere that was away from his old haunts so he wouldn't be tempted to feed his addictions. What exactly happened during Rames's first 2 weeks in the property isn't exactly clear, but it seemed that Rames's roommates and he didn't exactly see eye to eye. There was no kind of confrontation or animosity between them, but we know for certain that at some point, Ramesh complained to a friend that he didn't like the vibes between himself and his housemates. Yet despite their apparent bad vibes, Ramesh chose to extend his stay in the property, which added an extra 210 Australian dollars to his bill. Yet on his final day at the property, Ramesh was horrified to find that he had no money in his bank account. It was later claimed that this was because his employer had forgotten or neglected to pay him, but regardless of the reason, Ramesh had to face the music and tell the landlord that he didn't have the money to pay him. The landlord, a man named Jason Colton, was no fan of Ramesh. He was apparently extremely suspicious of his demeanor and had long suspected that he would be unable to pay the extra money to stay in the property's spare room. Yet there's no way that Ramesh could possibly have suspected the extreme nature of Jason's reaction. He figured they'd be able to work something out, delay payment by a couple of days until Ramesh could get in touch with his employer. But it seems that Jason was not in the mood to discuss the matter like a gentleman, and what should have been a simple discussion turned into a living nightmare for Ramesh Januzzi. Just as Ramesh was planning on talking to the landlord about his current financial situation, Jordan and the two other young men who lived at the property burst into his room to confront him. They had heard Ramesh packing his belongings in the bedroom and assumed he was about to do a runner, as one of them later phrased it, which is why they seemed to be heading him off before he could do so. Ramesh apologized profusely before showing Jason a banking app on his phone, illustrating that he didn't have the money he owed. He offered to get in touch with his employer and that he could probably get the money over to Jason over the days that followed. As he spoke, Jason's features turned from pale pink to deep red, and as he finished talking, his rage erupted in a fiery display of pure wrath. Jason grabbed hold of Ramesh by the throat and pushed him up against the wall, choking the young man violently as he tried in vain to free himself. Jason wasn't exactly a giant, but he still towered over the small stature of Ramesh, on top of being considerably stronger than him. It was with Ramesh being in this completely helpless position that Jason began to pummel him mercilessly, throwing his fists into his face over and over again until his nose and cheekbones were broken. What became clear much later is that Jason simply did not believe that Ramesh didn't have his money. The landlord had gotten it into his head somehow that Ramesh was trying to somehow get one over on him by showing him an empty bank account, when really he had the money stashed somewhere else. Jason continued to brutally assault Ramesh with the help of the two other men that resided at the property, and at some point, the confrontation spilled out into the front yard. The neighbor that had called the police later said that they saw a man limping from the front door of the property, one who was trying to scream but was unable to do so thanks to being choked by the enraged Jason Colton. Ramesh tried all he could to escape, but Jason continually dragged him back onto the lawn, demanding that he check his bank account again to prove he wasn't lying. But when Ramesh once again showed him an account with less than 10 Australian dollars in it, instead of calming down and figuring something out, Jason's rage was renewed. Only this time, he wanted not just to physically hurt Ramesh, but to humiliate him too. The landlord then took a plastic pencil case from Ramesh's belongings, stripped him half naked, then proceeded to shove the pencil case somewhere it really didn't belong. But Jason wasn't done yet. He began choking Ramis, demanding he pay the rent money that was owed, but Ramis was in no state to form a cohesive sentence. Instead of letting go to give him a chance to speak, Jason continued to keep Ramis in a chokehold. Ramis passed out, never to awaken again. With Ramis in the mortuary, Jason was charged with first-degree murder. A neighbor of his later testified that the disturbance was so loud that she could hear it from a few houses away, the distinct sound of a man screaming at the top of his lungs. It sounded like aggressive male behavior, she told the prosecutor, and I wasn't going anywhere near that. The prosecution had ample evidence of Jason's guilt, as his police interviews are a disturbing mess of lies and counterclaims until he is confronted with the fact that his victim had actually passed away. At that, Jason stated that Ramis deserved everything he got. But Ramis didn't fight back. He didn't pose a threat to the landlord at any stage. He was mercilessly beaten and choked to death on the front lawn of a small suburban home, all for just a few $100s. The jury saw Jason for what he was, the lowest kind of scum, and convicted him of murder before a judge handed him an 11-year prison sentence. When we use services like Airbnb, we take a great deal of comfort in the flashy website and lose ourselves in the glossy photographs of our potential rentals. We're quick to forget all the company is doing is hooking us up with other regular people, and that pretty much anyone can post an advertisement. How many other people like Jason are out there? How many other violent psychopaths are renting rooms to unwary strangers who would turn from tenants to victims at the first provocation? We should definitely all be careful who we interact with on websites like Airbnb, because we might be renting rooms we'll never leave.
To start, both my parents and I have grown up in a small southeastern town in Kentucky. The landscape is quite rural, and the actual city seat only has one stoplight in it, even in 2019. For the most part, the area is peaceful, and it feels as if everyone knows each other. While this story doesn't involve the paranormal, it is extremely terrifying. A real-life nightmare, if you will. The story begins on September 18, 1989 in the county's only high school. Both of my parents were teachers at this said school. My mother happened to be in her planning period and was sitting in her teacher's lounge with a few other personnel. Their planning was cut short when a fellow female teacher ran screaming immediately into the teacher's round, stating, "He's got a gun! He's got a gun!" Understandably, the teacher was too distressed to explain in detail and immediately ran screaming out of the lounge. Everyone immediately scrambled to escape or hide from the gunmen. My mother, a fellow teacher, and teacher's aide ran into a small closet and attempted to hide. The closet was tiny, and along with 3 small women currently occupying it, was also home to a fold-away bed. No matter how hard they tried to close the door, the bed kept getting in the way. They were afraid to open the door and shove the bed out, as it would be a dead giveaway that someone was in the closet. After the initial shock, things began to quiet down in the school. They could hear a few shots fired, but had no idea how close the gunfire was in proximity to them. They literally crammed like sardines in a hot closet, unsure when or if the shooter would come for them. Though they tried to remain silent, my mother did make a plea for their salvation, as it was almost certain they wouldn't make it out of the school alive. The time ticked away slowly, and after an hour of being in the closet, they began to hear footsteps. The footsteps were slowly coming down the hallway toward the room they were in. Soft sounds, clicking, as if someone was searching around the hallway. As they came closer, the footsteps stopped in the doorway of the teacher's lounge. It was almost as if they could feel a pair of eyes searching the room from top to bottom, looking for any sign of life. My mom and the other woman had their hands on the doorknob, trying to keep it closed as much as possible. They were almost certain this was the end. Suddenly, they heard the person walk away and enter a nearby bathroom. My father also had a free first block, so he was seated at his desk trying to catch up on grading student assignments. Suddenly he heard a loud noise which he said sounded like a large table falling over. He wondered at what the sound might be, but figured it was simply a table that had gotten knocked over or someone had dropped several textbooks. Unlike the teacher's lounge, my father's classroom was located upstairs in a smaller portion of the school. While he continued grading papers, he began to hear someone running down the hallway. It was a teacher that seemed to be searching through the classrooms. He stopped in the doorway and said, "One of the kids brought a gun and has taken hostages. We need to evacuate the other classmates immediately." My dad quickly said, "I'll take the right side of the hall and you take the left." They then set off running down the halls to notify teachers and students. However, most of the classrooms had already been emptied. They would find out later that many of the classrooms had heard the initial gunshots and realized instantly what the sound was. The first floor classrooms had tried to evacuate by either running to the far stairwell or jumping out the windows into the parking lot. The classroom doors had small windows in which you could see people passing outside. The classroom that was located across the gunfire had been too scared to exit into the hallway, at risk of being shot. The students were all jumping out of the windows in droves. The poor teacher was heavily pregnant, and the windows were quite narrow and only slanted slightly when they opened. It took a great deal of effort, but they got her out of the window. The students and teachers were scared for their life, not knowing if the shooter would suddenly barge into their room and begin shooting as they tried to exit. My dad eventually located a classroom that had not been evacuated. He ran over to the teacher and explained the situation. He then spoke to the students and told them, "You need to exit the school right now. Don't take your belongings. Don't go to the bathroom. Don't talk to anyone. As quietly as you can, take the far stairwell and don't look behind you. Go now." My dad is likely one of the most laid-back individuals you could ever meet. The students knew this and listened closely, knowing the situation was dire. Everyone rushed to the far stairwell, away from the gunmen, and exited to the bus garage. Dad said that the police arrived within minutes of them emptying the building and corralled everyone over to a funeral home that was across the road from the high school. Within 30 minutes, a SWAT team arrived and had set up a perimeter both inside and outside of the school. A family member had found out about the situation and called my grandfather, my mother's father. He had rushed to the school to check on his daughter and son-in-law. As my dad was waiting with the students in the funeral home parking lot, he began to search for my mother. My father asked one of the teachers that had been in the lounge with my mom if he had seen her. He said he thought she was outside. Dad once again searched through the crowd asking if anyone had seen my mother. By this time, my grandfather had arrived and asked my father where my mom was. He said that he couldn't find her. He again asked the teacher who had been in the lounge with her, and he said, "Well, come to think of it, I remember her saying that she might hide in the closet." Everyone was terrified of what might have happened to her, since it had been close to 3 hours since the gunmen had entered the building. My father and grandfather notified some of the Kentucky State Police that were on the scene. Under the watchful eyes of snipers located in the parking lot and on the roof, the KSP officers entered the school and headed for the closet they thought my mother was in. My mother said that she and the other woman could hear someone outside, and they almost died of fright. Without announcement, the doorknob was suddenly ripped from their hands, and light flooded into the closet. Not hearing a cacophony of gunfire, my mom looked up and realized there were 2 armed state troopers standing outside the closet. She said that it was probably the best sight in her entire life. There were no times for tears of joy, though. The officers told my mother and the other 2 women, "You're going to be okay, but we need to get you out of the building ASAP. We need you to rush down the hallway, and when you come into the lobby to exit, you need to run." After a count, my mother was ushered from teacher's lounge toward the high school lobby. She said when she rounded the corner, there were multiple snipers set up in the hall along with a .50 caliber machine gun pointed at the classroom where the shooter was. That day, my mother had worn a dress and heels, and she said she could remember trying to run across the grass in her heels, getting stuck in the soil. She kept running through until she joined the others in the funeral home parking lot. The initial takeover had begun around 9:50 a.m. during the first block of classes. The shooter had entered the school with 3 guns, 1 shotgun, a .357 pistol, and a .44 caliber Magnum, and walked into his first block class. Upon entering the classroom, he shot into the ceiling through the art classroom located above. Luckily, no one was hit by a bullet or debris of the initial shot. He released 2 rows of students and the teacher before settling in for a standoff. The woman that initially told everyone in the teacher's lounge about the shooting had been the teacher released from the classroom. Over the next few hours, students were released for small requests like cigarettes, soft drinks, and pizza. Multiple shots were fired throughout the ordeal, but thankfully no one was injured or killed. The shooter was later identified as a 17-year-old student at the high school, advised police that he would surrender if he could see his father. He told police that he hadn't seen his father since he was 4 years old. Around 5 p.m. that day, the last hostage was released. The Kentucky State Police eventually negotiated his surrender before his father could arrive from Florida. While most people never know the reason behind such an insane act of violence, upon questioning, the shooter referred to the Stephen King book Rage as his inspiration for the shooting. Crazy enough, my dad didn't think the student served any prison time. It was his belief that while the boy was initially taken to jail after surrendering, he was never tried and was instead released out of the county and told to never return. I guess 1989 was a different time. My dad says that word had quickly spread after the takeover, and that many parents had arrived to the scene and were looking for their children. One of them asked my father where his son was, and my dad wasn't for sure, and that's what he told the parent. However, he had been too afraid to tell him that he thought he was currently being held hostage. It turns out he was. Many of the students held hostage suffered from PTSD and had to undergo counseling for many years. Fortunately, no one was physically harmed, though. Once my parents were finally released from the scene, they had driven straight to my babysitters to pick me up. Being less than a year old, I was oblivious to the chaos that my parents had experienced that day. They say when they saw me, they picked me up and prayed that the little girl would never have to experience anything like that.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel as essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
Hello. Before I start this story, I want to give you a backstory real quick. I'm an 18-year-old female living in Mesa, Arizona. I had started door dashing to make some extra money, as working a hostess really wasn't paying the bills like it used to. My little sister, who's 16, and my mom and I had just moved down here from Phoenix, so this is somewhat of a different area to door dash in than I'm used to. We started off doing a couple of runs around the area until I got a ping that I have a new order. It was for Little Caesars. I pulled up the map and I headed that way. When we arrived, I had sent in my sister to get the order. While she was in there, I was looking around the parking lot. It was pitch black outside, other than my headlights and the store sign. I noticed a white Jeep and a few teenage guys getting inside of it. I didn't pay much attention afterwards. When my sister got back in the car with the order, I proceeded to the delivery address, with my sister talking to me and music blaring. I pulled into the neighborhood that the map took me to. I then turned on the music to look for the house. We stopped in the middle of the street in front of the house, not realizing that a guy was coming to my door. Now, he didn't say anything at first. I said, "Did you order DoorDash?" And he said, "Yeah," with a little hesitation. I looked behind him, and I saw that there were two other guys heading towards my driver's side door as well. I didn't notice that they had just pulled into the driveway, and they were driving a white Jeep. Before I go any further, my boyfriend has a switchblade knife that he always carries around, so I automatically know the sound of it being opened and closed. After he said yes, I noticed that he got closer to my window, and I was looking at my phone, about to ask him what the name for it was. And when I looked back at him, he was fiddling in his pocket on his right side. He kept looking back and nudging his head forward, kind of in a motion like, "Come here," to the other guys. All of a sudden, when I was about to roll my window down to give him his order, I heard the click, and that's when my brain just pieced it all together. He gave me a weird look, and I said, "You know what, fuck this." And I rolled up my window to where there was about an inch until it was closed, and then locked all the doors and took off. I didn't hear anything from them. They didn't yell out for us. I was really freaking out, and my sister didn't know why I pulled off like that. I explained to her what I heard, and then she pieced it all together as well. When I turned off their street, they then called me and said, "Yeah, this is Mario." And I said, "Yeah, are you the guy I just talked to?" And he said, "Yeah." And then I asked him why I heard a switchblade go off in his pocket, but he ignored the question. I asked him again, and it sounded like he was rushing to get into a car. I then pulled off into a curb, and I told him where he could pick up his food, and then hung up. We sat at the other end of the street for 10 minutes, and when we went back, the food was still there. We picked up the food again, and I was just going to call DoorDash and tell them what happened, and ask that they get a refund, until I saw the teenagers pass by and look straight at me and stop the car. I turned super quickly in the other direction, and I saw one of them get out of the car, then jump back in, and they then turned around and started following us. Now, I'm a crazy driver in general, but when someone's following me, my fight or flight kicked in, and I lost them pretty quickly. I called DoorDash and explained to them what happened and made a report. I don't know what those teenagers were up to, but as a female out at night with her little sister, I was terrified. Not just for me, but for my sister. Some of you may think that I was being overdramatic, and maybe they did just want their food, but if you were in my situation, what else could you really do? It was my safety and my sister's. I called up my boyfriend and told him everything that happened, and I couldn't stop shaking for the rest of the drive home. I couldn't ever figure out why they were at Little Caesars and got there before us. I know it was them who was there. Maybe they were following me back. Maybe not. I guess I'll never know. On the other hand though, I didn't call the cops. There probably wasn't much they could have done anyways, except for file a report. But let's just say, I'll never DoorDash in that area again.
The story takes place in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. For those who are not aware, the Appalachian mountain range is approximately 480 million years old, and I've always wondered, while hiking in the park, about what kind of animals once roamed the hills we hike today. In the summertime, the dense vegetation and the abundant rhododendrons can take you back to a prehistoric age when the dinosaurs would have foraged among the same hills the hikers now casually walk, basking in the unparalleled beauty that is the Smokies. This event happened in late December, when the leaves fall off the deciduous trees, opening the hills to your eyes, allowing you to see the contours of the land as you hike. Me and my girlfriend were staying in the small town of Weir's Valley, which is approximately 45 minutes west of the bustling tourist trap of Gatlinburg. We'd stayed in Gatlinburg in years past and decided that this year we wanted a small cabin far from the normal hustle and bustle of the late December tourist rush. Many of the locals spitefully call this period from Christmas to New Year's Hell Week. Knowing this, we decided to stop at a small hiking store and inquired about a day hike that would take us far into the backcountry. They pulled out a map detailing the western end of the park and showed us multiple trails that would fit our description. We ended up settling on a trail that was about 4 miles one way, with a massive waterfall as the reward at the end of the trail. We arrived at the trailhead at about 9 in the morning, and there was only about one car there already. Perfect. It was an elderly couple getting their packs ready for their hike, and we were excited at the lack of hikers. As our goal for the day was to try and not see a human being for the entire hike, the first half of the hike was entirely uneventful. We reached the waterfall after about 2 hours or so, and sat down and took a lunch break before departing back towards the trailhead. Before I continue the story, I want to make a note that we had not seen a single person the entire hike so far. We had not even seen so much as a plane flying overhead. That's why we turned the corner on the trail and we froze in our places. There was a girl walking alone about 50 yards ahead of us. Now, normally it's not uncommon to see people hiking alone, but they typically look the part. They usually have a hiking pack, hiking shoes, and they'll almost always acknowledge you and ask you how your day is before you go in your separate ways. Not this girl. First and foremost, she did not look like she belonged out there. She looked like she was about 15 or 16 years old, and she did not have a bag or any water. She was about 15 or 16 wearing tennis shoes, which was odd considering that this rugged trail demanded heavy hiking boots. We were shocked to see her out this far by herself, and we were even more disturbed that we didn't see her before turning the corner on the trail. She essentially appeared out of nowhere. After me and my girlfriend exchanged concerned looks, we decided to continue down the trail as normal, as we didn't want this girl to turn around and see us just standing there and spook her. We made ourselves known as best as we could by kicking rocks with our boots and talking to each other. This girl didn't turn around and acknowledge us or even respond to us one time, even when we said hello. After about 50 yards of following her at a distance, we reached a creek crossing with a rudimentary path of dry rocks as the only way to cross. She put her arms out to balance herself, and we both noticed that when she put her arms up, it didn't look right. Unless you had terrible balance, there was no reason to balance yourself on this little creek crossing. Calling it a creek is almost giving it too much credit, as it was more like a gentle stream coming off the hill that crossed the trail and flowed to the river below. The water at its deepest was no more than 6 inches, and if you had halfway decent hiking boots, you could simply walk through the water without getting your feet wet. Wanting to be considerate of our fellow hiker, we decided to wait behind her as she arduously crossed the creek. She took way more time than she needed to cross, and it felt like she was deliberately walking slow to creep us out. We crossed the creek in about 30 seconds time after watching her take 2 or 3 minutes. Keep in mind, this creek was maybe 15 feet long at that, and as I mentioned, maybe 6 inches deep. I decided to cross before my girlfriend, because I had a nauseating feeling in the pit of my stomach about the entire situation, and I wanted to put something between her and my girlfriend. Because I had my eyes glued on this girl, I wasn't paying attention to where I was walking, and my foot slipped from the rock and fell into the water, making a very loud splash. Even though this girl was less than 20 feet ahead of us, she still did not turn around and acknowledge us. After me and my girlfriend crossed the creek, we could see that shortly ahead were a set of switchbacks going down the mountain. We decided to stop and put some distance between us and the girl. She was walking at an incredibly slow pace, and we waited for a couple of minutes before we saw that she had gone around the corner down the first switchback. Me and my girlfriend had a brief conversation about what the heck just happened, and we collected ourselves and continued down the trail. We didn't think anything much of it, we just tried to continue going without being unnerved any further. We thought that was the case, and so, when we turned down the first switchback and saw something terrible, well, we saw nothing at all. The girl had vanished, unless she took off at a sprint as soon as she turned the corner. We should have seen her. The switchback was very gradual, and we could clearly see the next 5 or 6 switchbacks below us. The leaves were gone off the trees, allowing us to see every foot of the trail below. Even if she started running, we would have heard her. The main river was about 500 feet below us, and the rushing water was barely audible from where we were standing. She either vanished, hid behind a tree from us, or somehow managed to sprint a quarter-mile down the mountain in complete silence away from us. We had absolutely no idea what to think, so we once again stopped to collect ourselves. We were terrified and were not sure whether to go back up the mountain or continue down as planned. After a hurried deliberation, we decided to proceed down the trail as normal. We never saw her. As we reached the trailhead, we ran into a group of hikers, and we figured we'd ask them if they saw a teenage girl hiking along without a backpack. They gave us a strange look, and said we were the first people they'd seen on the trail all day. We simply thanked them and continued, as to not scare them. I've always heard of paranormal things happening in the Smokies, from Bigfoot to skinwalkers to a group of wild mountain people living primitively within the park. I've always entertained these stories because who doesn't love a good ghost story? I've never anticipated having an encounter of my own in the woods. The scariest thing to me about the encounter all these years later, though, is that we never saw her face.
This happened in 2005. Me and my older brother lived with our single mom. I was a freshman in high school and my brother a senior. We had a pretty normal life. Our mom made good money as a lawyer, and me and my brother were happy. But one day, one of my mom's cases put our whole family in danger. My mom, being a lawyer, often prosecuted people in our city. In this case, she was prosecuting a man who had assaulted a woman. The man was found guilty and given 20 years in prison. Little did we know the son of this man went to me and my brother's high school. The family was very angry at my mother, especially the son, Kevin. He vowed to make my mom's life a living hell. Me and my brother knew nothing about this, though. Our mom never talked about her work with us, and threats are nothing new for lawyers, so no one thought anything of it. On the day it happened, it was like any other. I, being a shy and introverted girl, always went to the bathroom when no one else was using the stalls. This was a mistake. Our school walls were actually made out of glass, so anyone in the classroom could see you walking through the hallway. I know I hate the idea as well. Kevin must have seen me that day as I was walking to the bathroom. I was playing on my phone in one of the stalls when I heard the door crack open. Usually I'd brush it off as another girl who needed to fix her hair or use the bathroom. But this time something felt off. A feeling of dread and fear welled up in me, and instinctively I pulled my feet up off the ground. They laughed and whispered my last name maliciously, and almost instantly I knew he was a boy, and almost instantly it got worse. He started banging his hands on the stalls, slowly getting closer towards mine. Now absolutely terrified, my mind raced with horrific thoughts of what he would do to me. Blinded with fear, I made a horrible decision to run past him towards the door. I jumped out of the stall and sprinted as fast as I could. This unfortunately didn't work. He cut me off and pushed me into the tile floor. What I looked up to still haunts me to this day. Kevin standing above me, his face covered with a vicious smile. I stood up meekly and took a step back. "What do you want?" I managed to whimper out, my face now covered in tears. He didn't answer. He just took one intimidating step forward and pulled out a small knife. The next part is a bit of a blur. He said something about not screaming and tried to back me up against the wall. Unfortunately for him, I kicked and screamed and punched, though I don't think it did much. I was a small, scrawny 105-pound 14-year-old girl, while he was a giant 17-year-old football player. I don't think I would have gotten away if it wasn't for the fact that we were in a bathroom. Two girls walked in the midst of the chaos, giggling and talking. Through their screams and Kevin's surprise, I was able to bite onto Kevin's hand and escape his grasp. I ran into the bathroom screaming and crying for help. My first thought being to run to my older brother's English room. I trudged down the hallway slowly. Now that my adrenaline had gone down, I realized another danger. A hole in my shoulder and lower stomach was gushing blood. I hadn't felt it until now, but it seemed through our struggle Kevin had stabbed me with his knife. Kids and teachers were now peering through the glass and coming out into the hallway to see what was happening. The two girls who had saw us in the bathroom were screaming, drawing a crowd. I started getting confused in the crowd of kids. My vision was getting blurred, and I felt lightheaded. The loss of blood probably affecting me. Everyone was screaming and running around, and the teacher's attempts to calm everyone was failing. Luckily, I found my brother through this. If I hadn't, I might have died. Running into him, he grabbed my shoulder, making me look up. This part is also a blur, but my friends and brother told me what happened next. My brother told me I had slumped over onto the ground right as I found him. My best friend, also in the hallway, told me my brother had yelled something like, "Help! My sister is bleeding!" This got the attention of everyone, and some teachers ran over to me and my brother. Students started calling 911 as a teacher and my brother tried to stop the bleeding. My brother has a big temper, so he started yelling at everyone and asking who had done this. The girls thought Kevin might still be in the bathroom, so my brother ran over there. I wish my brother hadn't gone to the bathroom, though, because all of the other kids followed him. Kevin apparently hadn't moved from the spot near the wall, and he hadn't even tried to hide the knife. My brother then proceeded to try and beat up Kevin. Luckily, though, classmates held him back. I was taken to the hospital, and Kevin was arrested. Kevin had actually damaged some organs when he stabbed me near my bladder, so I had to have immediate surgery with only a 40% chance of survival. They then put me in an induced coma because of the pain, and so I wouldn't rip any equipment connected to my body. I survived, but was in a coma for a month. When I was taken out of the coma, it was a tough recovery, partly because of the coma, but also because of the trauma of almost being stabbed to death. The school had covered up the story by the time I woke up. No one was allowed to talk about it, but the kids spread rumors anyways. I decided to recover for the rest of the year before going back to school, and then I returned to my everyday life. Though things have not been the same since that experience, my brother became really overprotective, and my mom quit her job, and Kevin was never seen again. I also have had recurring nightmares of Kevin since the incident. Now that I'm an adult, things have settled down for our family. And you know what? Even though Kevin tried to kill me and put me in a coma, I hope he's got himself figured out now. He obviously needed help, and none was given to him. Kevin, if you hear this, answer this question. Are you afraid of knives now? Because I'm afraid of bathrooms. In January of 1992, Kelly Day Wilson was just a 17-year-old senior at Gilmer High School. With her well-coiffed curly blonde hair and extravagant jewelry choices and bright blue eyes, Kelly Day was a pretty picture, and had no problem making friends after she relocated from Natchitoches, Louisiana to Gilmer, Texas, so she could live with her mother and stepfather. She hit the ground running and struck up an on-again, off-again relationship with a young man by the name of Chris Denton, and the two spent a great deal of time together in the lead-up to the new year. It seems Kelly's life was going swimmingly well, and it's clear that no one could have possibly expected what fate had in store for her, something that would raise questions among true crime enthusiasts that pervade even today. On January 5th, 1992, Kelly finished her shift at the Gilmer Square outlet of Northeast Texas Video, closing the store at around 8:30 p.m. before heading over to a local bank to deposit the store's daily takings. This particular bank branch's security cameras showed that an individual did indeed make the night deposit for that evening, but the captured footage didn't provide a clear enough image of the person for a positive identification of Kelly, simply showing an arm in her car. We can presume it was her, but we can't be 100% certain. After locking down the store's shutters with her manager, Joe, he wished Kelly good night before driving away in his truck. The last he ever saw of her, she was last seen wearing cut-off stonewashed jeans, a purple rugby shirt with gold trim, and brown loafers, and was getting into her car in preparation for her night drive to the bank. But Kelly didn't arrive home that night, nor did she check in with any of her friends. Her mother became so worried that she sent her stepfather out into the night to aid in the police search that ensued. And like grim providence, it was him that found Kelly's abandoned car in the Northeast Texas Video parking lot at around 5 a.m. The car was sporting a single slash tire, and all of Kelly's personal belongings, including her purse, were inside of her car. Only she and her keys were missing. At first glance, what happened appeared to be a complete mystery, but it was one that local law enforcement was determined to get to the bottom of. For 2 years, the investigation into Kelly's disappearance was headed up by a Sergeant James Brown. One of the first people investigated was obviously Joe, her manager, and the last person to see her alive. However, not only did Joe have multiple alibis, he passed several lie detector tests issued by the police, and as a result, he was rolled out as a suspect. Sergeant Brown oversaw a team consisting of hundreds of police officers and local volunteers, one of which poured thousands of man-hours into an intensive search of the surrounding area. Yet despite such a thorough search, as well as hundreds of tips from the general public, not a single trace of Kelly was ever found. Police believed that they were close when they arrested 17-year-old Michael Bibby, who was taken into custody on misdemeanor charges in an incident of alleged tire slashing. Michael was guilty of many, many things, but as police discovered, slashing Kelly's tires wasn't one of them, and in the end, he too was ruled as a suspect in Kelly's disappearance. Investigators then turned their gaze to another suspect, Kelly's on and off again boyfriend, Chris Denton. The couple were said to have been going through a rough patch at the time of her disappearance, and with people saying that Chris had something of a short temper, there was a period where he became the case's prime suspect. However, through the course of the investigation, circumstantial evidence would clear him of all wrongdoing, and the police would be forced to look elsewhere for their abductor. Unbelievably, in a number of interviews conducted in the process of their investigation, police had heard a handful of stories alluding to a satanic cult that called Gilmer home. But since the accusations named members of law enforcement as members of the cult, specifically Sergeant James Brown himself, the claims weren't taken seriously by those that heard them. Yet, in 1994, the local community was rocked by almost 50 indictments against 10 different people, all on charges of child abuse. And given some of the evidence presented against them, police proceeded with charges of aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, and capital murder in connection with Kelly Day Wilson's disappearance. It's at this point that Kelly's story seems to intersect with that of the Kerr family, because in 1990, a man named Wendell Kerr told his wife, Loretta, that he wanted a divorce, kicking off a chain of events that would bring prosecutors their one best chance at finding the perpetrator. Wendell Kerr was one of 6 adult children of Eugene and Geneva Kerr, a couple who were briefly married in the 1950s before a hastily divorce. Geneva Kerr went on to marry 2 other men, both of whom died before Geneva remarried Eugene, making him both her first and her 4th husband. According to their children, Eugene and Geneva Kerr abused their children on a daily basis. A relative later confirmed their claims of carnal abuse and spoke of witnessing daily incidents of indecent assault. This same relative also confirmed that they'd witnessed Geneva Kerr's interest in satanic practices, including daily readings from the Satanic Bible and an interest in both animal and human sacrifices. In exchange for law enforcement's help escaping the Kerr family, one of their grown-up sons' wives offered to tell investigators everything. She claimed she was kept as a slave to the family for 10 years, couldn't drive a car, constantly threatened by Geneva and Danny, and her only form of identification, her birth certificate, was kept by Danny in his wallet. In her own horrifying words, her role was simply as a breeder. Cut back to Wendell asking his wife for a divorce. Loretta strongly began to suspect that Wendell was trying to ditch her for a younger woman, and if that was the case, she was going to burn his entire life down before she left. She went to the police with accusations, and as a result, Wendell was arrested, placed on the offenders register, and forced to serve out a period of probation. A state welfare worker assigned to the case later concluded that ritualistic, satanic abuse was endemic in all branches of the Kerr family, and over the next several years, almost a dozen of the clan's children were taken into the care of Child Protective Services. The social worker also mentioned in a horrifying affidavit that in October of 1992, 2 of the children took us to show us where the devil meet people to abuse and hurt babies. In 1994, the escaped Kerr wife was interviewed by the Harrison County Jail in Marshall, Texas, in which she described in gruesome detail the torture that Kelly Wilson would receive for approximately 9 days before she was ritually sacrificed and then cannibalized. She described Geneva as the leader and said that several of the Kerr clan, along with Sergeant James Brown, were all present during these events. Connie Martin and Wanda Kerr both had stated in interviews that Kelly Wilson was a birthday present for Geneva Kerr, and that the matriarch reveled in the poor girl's torment. Yet, in light of the accusations, it came to light that information was allegedly coerced from the Kerr children, as well as some of those indicted in the disappearance. Some of the children were allegedly programmed to tell the stories the investigators wanted, while the prosecution tried to coerce a confession by offering life in prison in opposition to the death penalty as long as they confessed to the killing, best summarized in a quote from a state official that reads, "Investigators working on little more than hearsay have created a mythology about a satanic cult, leading to what some describe as a modern witch hunt. They indicted a whole family and even a police investigator, destroying his law enforcement career, straining his marriage and prompting death threats. The Texas Attorney General, finding no evidence any of the charges were true, instead uncovered suggestions that the whole cult theory was the product of coercion by overzealous investigators, even to the point that they physically restrained children to elicit allegations of satanic activity. Ultimately, the Attorney General's office were forced to dismiss every single one of the charges alleging satanic abuse and sacrificial murder. The satanic cult was found to be a complete fabrication, nothing more than a fantasy concocted by the Kerr children under the influence of police investigators. Chris Denton, Kelly's old boyfriend, tragically died of cancer in 2004, but there were rumors that he had made a deathbed confession. But close family dismissed these allegations as thoughtless, malicious hearsay and maintain Chris's innocence to this day. Joe Henry, the owner and manager of the Northeast Texas Video and the last person to see Kelly before she vanished, stayed mostly under the radar for a number of years. But in a despicable twist in the story, Joe was arrested on charges of possessing indecent images of children. However, police have emphasized that in spite of the nature of the charges against him, he had never been considered a serious suspect in Kelly's case. For all the twists and turns, trials and confessions, finger-pointing, and numerous suspects, Kelly Wilson has never been found, despite 20 years of searching. She is presumed dead, but a body has never been found and no valid charges have ever been made in connection with the case. Without a body or Audrey's Jeep being recovered, there's simply no way of coming up with any definitive explanation as to why she disappeared. There must be a rational explanation as to why she vanished, but given the circumstances, for all intents and purposes, Audrey and her vehicle basically dropped off the face of the earth, never to be seen again.
This past Christmas was me and my girlfriend's 3-year anniversary. We don't typically do much, so this year we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Wyoming, and we rented a cabin in the snowy mountains for the weekend. We found the cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were instantly sold. The cabin was in the middle of pretty much nowhere. The nearest other house was a half-mile away. To get to it, you had to drive down a small, removed, private road. We got to the cabin, and we both looked at each other, not thinking it was going to be that desolate. But we quickly brushed it off, as the cabin was amazing. We went inside, and there was a booklet with all the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season to not be surprised if their contracted snowplowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Alright, well that was fine, we both thought. We unpacked, and quickly realized there was no service on either of our phones, though the booklet in the cabin told us that there was a landline if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire playing board games and drinking wine. It was honestly really nice. The weekend was exactly what we needed. Now, at this point, it was only 6 p.m. We planned to spend the next night in town, and this night, I booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone for quite a while, not returning till about 10. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing to end off the night. Now, something that should be mentioned is it had been snowing all day. As we were driving back, we both took notice to how much more snow had piled up outside. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway, though I stopped the car in front of the house with my headlights shining. My girlfriend looked at me confused. There were clearly fresh tire tracks on the driveway, and I asked her if she saw them too. We both knew this couldn't have been us, as we hadn't even driven on the driveway itself, just the nearby street. Immediately though, we remembered the snowplowers that could have stopped by, but the issue was, we saw the tire tracks because of the snow. And who plows the snow in the pitch black dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no cell service on our phones. We both agreed to head back into town and message our Airbnb host and ask him if one of his friends had stopped by the cabin. We got into town and sent over a text. We proceeded to wait for a reply, but unfortunately, we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point it was past 10 and we didn't want to be disrespectful guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion, and might as well head back to the cabin. We just figured we must have been psyching ourselves out over nothing. We drove back, and this time we actually drove up on the driveway. As we got out of the car, my stomach dropped as I noticed fresh footprints on the property. From what it looked like, someone had drove up on the driveway, parked, and then got out of the car and walked onto the property. Since we had also now driven on the tracks, we couldn't find where the footprints ended. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and bushes. We knew that the footprints could have gone anywhere. We decided to call the police, as the whole situation was too weird. We figured it was better safe than sorry. We would just have the officer go up to the property with us and check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. When the policeman showed up, we led him to the footprints. He scanned the property, and even partly in the surrounding woods, but determined there was no one out there, or anywhere near. Obviously, we were a little shaken up, but thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us were in the mood to sit in the hot tub in the dark woods after the whole situation. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie I had downloaded on my laptop in one of the bedrooms. Though, we were both tired from the whole day and had passed out not too far into the movie. Fast forward to 3 a.m., and I woke up. I remember seeing my laptop had finished the movie with my girlfriend fast asleep right next to me. I shut off the laptop and set it on the nightstand. Though, I was pretty confused as to what woke me up, as I'm a pretty deep sleeper and won't wake up to almost anything. That's when I heard a slight bump on the bedroom window. The curtains were closed, so I couldn't see what produced the sound. I figured it must have been a small clump of snow falling on the window, and proceeded to lay back down to fall back asleep. But not even 10 seconds later, the sound came again. This time a little louder. At that point, I thought it best to get out of bed, pull back the curtains, and see what was making the noise. And so I did. I got up and opened the curtains, but there was nothing. I turned on my flashlight on my phone to get a better look, as honestly all I could see was darkness. I had to open the window so the light wouldn't glare, and right as I did, my light revealed fresh footprints in the snow right under the window. I was instantly put on edge. I proceeded to point my flashlight into the darkness, and I swear I could see a figure just standing there in the snow maybe 10 yards out. The footprints under the window led exactly to where the figure was standing. My heart dropped, but I stayed calm. I closed the window and woke up my girlfriend, telling her we had to go. She asked me why, but I didn't tell her, knowing she would freak out. I just said we needed to pack our stuff and leave immediately. Confused, she complied. About 10 minutes after I'd seen the man out the window, we both had all of our stuff at the front door and were ready to make a dash for it to the car. And so we did. I opened the door and we dashed outside to the driveway with all of our stuff and got inside. I started the car and was starting to reverse out of the driveway when my girlfriend screamed. I looked to where she was looking in reaction, and there the figure was, right beside the house, now just watching us leave. I booked it out of there, not looking back. Once we got far enough to have cell service, we sent over a text to the Airbnb's host explaining the whole situation. And later that morning, we would get a text back from the guy. He said that he went to the cabin, and there were indeed footprints all around the building. He said the footprints stopped at every window. This freaked us both out, but realistically it was out of our hands now. We never heard back from the guy, so we never ended up knowing if anything ever came of the whole situation. But that figure, and just the whole experience in general, still terrifies me and my girlfriend to this day.
This story happened my senior year of high school, which was about 5 years ago now. That year, they added this new room at the back part of the school. I can't remember the exact name they used for the room, but it was basically just an area with several computers and tables, and it was used for giving students extra help with school or making up tests and things like that. It had been made out of an old abandoned classroom that wasn't used for several years. At this time, I had been out of school for 2 days with an ear infection, and in that time, I missed a math test. When I returned to the math teacher, he allowed me to make up the test during study hall, so I went to that new room to take it. The teacher, Mr. Marcus, didn't want to have to go to the room and watch me take the test, so he let me go by myself and said he trusted me not to cheat. I walked all the way over to the room, which was pretty much on the complete opposite end of the school, and once I got to the room, I sat down and began the test. It wasn't too long of a test, but it was a really important one. Right when I got to the third question, the telephone in the room started ringing. I didn't want to get up and answer it, but I figured it was probably Mr. Marcus. I walked over and picked it up. When I did, I was told we were under a lockdown and there was a suspicious person in the building. I was scared being all by myself back in this room with nobody else there, and there wasn't even a classroom next to me I could go to, because this classroom was between 2 locker rooms for the gym, which was also nearby. I did what I was instructed to do and shut the door. As I did, I decided to take a quick look out into the hallway. It was completely empty and quiet as well. I went back in and decided to turn off the lights. I went out of sight of the door and went towards the back. Then I took out my phone and used the screen to give me some light to try to do more questions of the test. However, I couldn't really focus with us being in a lockdown. Suddenly, I heard the door to the room that I was in open. It was at that moment that I remembered I hadn't locked the door.
Quickly, I ducked down underneath the table that I was at. I could see just barely from under the table a small amount of light coming in from the doorway and saw boots on the ground. At least they appeared to be boots, as I couldn't really see much. I was terrified, and I held my breath so that I wouldn't make a sound. Whoever was in there stood in the doorway for a while, and then the door shut. I barely heard footsteps walking into the room. I was literally shaking, trying not to make a sound. The room then went completely silent and remained that way. I slowly breathed in and out as quietly as I could. I was expecting at any moment to feel someone grab me from behind or something like that. But then, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of a computer falling off a desk to the ground. Then I heard the noise of a man yelling and screaming. It seemed as though whoever was in this room had gone into a rage and was screaming and smashing things. I opened my eyes and looked over. I still couldn't really see anything, but I could hear where all the noise was coming from, and it was at the opposite end of the classroom to my left. I was terrified and knew I needed to get out of there. The exit was directly in front of me and to the right, and the noises were directly in front of me to the left, so I figured I had to make a run for it. I took a deep breath, and then got out from under the desk and ran as fast as I could, as whoever was in there continued to seemingly destroy things in the room. I ran forward to the door and was just barely able to see where I was going. I stumbled into a chair just before the door, but I was still able to make it out. I heard the man yelling as I left the room and sprinted down the hallway. I ran all the way to the front end of the school, where I saw a police officer. I yelled where the guy was and that he was destroying things. Another officer led me out of the school. After some time, I was able to calm down and they ended up catching the man. I got to go home right after that. I feel so lucky that I made it out of that room, because obviously whoever was in there was very dangerous.
Closing shift at Subway. Submitted by Donutio. I'm 20 years old and I live in Canada. This story took place during the 2016 clown craze in October, about 10 to 20 minutes before my Subway store was going to close. To make things a little easier to understand, I've got to give a brief explanation of the layout of our store. So there's the front door that customers walk through, which is completely made of glass. Then there's the windows to the left, if you're standing behind the counter facing the front. The bathroom is beside the swinging door that employees use to get to the sandwich unit. This all began while I was finishing doing dishes in the back room. I was the only person there because they rarely had more than one employee for the closing shift, unless of course it was for training purposes. Really, only one employee is needed, even though it might not be a smart decision. There hadn't been any customers for a while, and I really had to go to the bathroom, so I started making my way to the swinging door by the sandwich unit, when all of a sudden I heard the bell ding at the front door, indicating that a customer had entered. I was honestly a bit annoyed because I'd been putting off going to the bathroom for a long time, and obviously I can't leave someone unattended in the front store. Before I even turned around to take the person's order, and I know it's going to sound odd, but I heard the generic sound of a clown's nose honking. It sent shivers and goosebumps through my entire body. As I hesitantly turned around to confirm what I had just heard, there was someone standing at the door with a bright orange afro and white face paint. Beyond that, they were dressed extremely casually, though in a plain green zip-up hoodie and black jeans, which almost made it creepier. They stared at me and smiled from ear to ear. Before I could even think of doing anything, they gave me a sinister little wave before quickly running out of the store and around the left side window. I was frozen in place. I was wondering, was this really happening? Or better yet, why was this happening? I didn't know the clown craze reached my small town. I just stared at the window for what felt like 10 minutes. Once I came to, I ran to the front door and just locked it. There was no way I was letting anyone in, even if we weren't closed yet. But before I did, I poked my head around the corner to make sure that lunatic was gone for sure. Well, I didn't see anything. He was gone, I thought. I couldn't see him anywhere. The parking lot was empty save for my car, so I went back in the store and locked the doors, counting the seconds until the actual closing time was here. But not 10 minutes until closing, a couple of cops were knocking at the door. I was nervous, yet relieved to see them. I immediately unlocked the doors and let them inside. Apparently, they were there to just ask me a few questions. They wanted to know if I had seen someone dressed with an orange afro and white makeup. Yeah, I was excited to tell them that some creep was out there so that they could catch this guy. Well, they explained that someone called not too long ago, saying that they drove by and saw someone matching that description in the subway parking lot, kneeling behind a green sedan. They were holding a carving knife. My heart seemed to stop. That was my car. This psycho was waiting for me behind my car. If the cops hadn't scared him away by showing up, he'd still be out there. What would have happened if I walked out there alone at closing time? I was scared more than I'd ever been, but the cops offered to walk me to my car and even check it if I needed them to. I happily obliged. Then I got out of there and stayed the night with a family member nearby, because after that horrific experience, I couldn't be alone. The clown craze was always hilarious in my eyes until something actually happened to me. There was just something horrifying about the contrast of the clown hair and makeup, along with normal everyday clothing. Better yet, what would have happened if I was already in the bathroom, defenseless and unaware? I'm so thankful I held it for as long as I did, and that some stranger drove by and saw this weirdo. I'm happy that I didn't find out what this lunatic was capable of. You can bet I don't work the closing shift at Subway anymore.
For quick background info, I was 12 years old when this occurred. I'm 14 now. I have 2 younger brothers. For the sake of this story, we'll call them Dylan and Tyler. They share a room on the 2nd floor, and the room is at the front of the house with a balcony door facing the street. Straight behind their room is a hallway, and my room is on the left of that hallway if you're looking from the front of the house. There's 2 windows facing the side of my house and my room. At the time of this story, I was in my brother's room watching Tyler play a video game. I think it was Cuphead. This will be important later. This took place in mid-July of 2019. It was nearing the end of the day. I and my mom had decided to order in for herself and my dad. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Well, about 10 minutes later, my mom randomly starts walking in my brother's room and looking at the shutters on the door. Me and my brothers don't really pay any attention until we notice she keeps doing it, and she looks much more nervous than normal. My brothers ask what's wrong, and my mom surprisingly, and she tells us that the delivery driver was sending her really weird messages, such as, God is coming. He will come for all who don't believe. Believe, and he'll bring you to paradise. Tyler was starting to get nervous, but I was much more confused than anything. But that confusion turned to fear, as not even 3 minutes later, this delivery driver was right outside our house, empty-handed, screaming and laughing, obviously high off his mind. At this point, Tyler was nearly in tears, and I was absolutely horrified, but I didn't do anything. I couldn't do anything. But as quickly as he came, he was gone. My mom filed a complaint with both the restaurant and the delivery service, and the next day she was notified that he had been terminated. That in and of itself wouldn't be that bad, but it gets worse. Now for this next part. I can't confirm that these 2 events were related, but the timing suggests it was. The day my mom was notified of the delivery driver's termination went on like normal, and around 10:30 p.m., I was the only person awake. This was pretty customary. My brothers like going to bed early, and I think my parents were asleep, but I can't be sure. Anyways, around that time, I noticed out my window the motion light turn on. At first I thought it was the neighbors, but I realized soon that it was ours. And the thing about our motion sensor light is that something pretty noticeable has to trigger it. Something like a mouse won't. I looked outside and I didn't see anything until I looked to my right, just out of the light's radius. That's when I noticed something. Someone. Then I realized someone is in my backyard and I'm the only one awake. It didn't even occur to me that I could wake up my parents, but instead, I dug down under the window, praying whoever was out there didn't see me. I'm honestly astounded that 12-year-old me didn't even scream. But I think he noticed me, because when I checked again about 5 minutes later, he was gone. I'm 99% sure that it was the same guy, and he was either scouting out the place or trying to scare us. But thankfully, nothing else happened after that. I only remembered this recently because my mom brought it up, and all of the memories of it came flooding back. So to the crazy high screaming delivery driver that I'm nearly positive was trying to break in, stay the fuck away from me and my family.
In Michigan, there's a little place called Traverse City. It's a smallish, very esoteric hippie kind of town. In this town, there's a bona fide abandoned mental institution, complete with an absolutely enormous deserted grounds and dilapidated buildings, an old rusty water tower, and a huge stone basin in the middle of the woods that could hold maybe about 50 people. You know, the works. This actually isn't the creepy part, believe it or not, as nothing scary really happened there. It was actually quite the popular hangout for college kids to get stoned and whatnot. It's more of a small detail on just how strange this town is, and kind of a backstory. You see, when the mental ward shut down, the patients were basically let loose to their own devices, and many of them ended up as one of the many homeless people that just roamed the town, and some of them just ended up in the Whiting. The Whiting was the cheapest apartment in town, basically a month-to-month hotel. It really wasn't a bad place. There was a housekeeper that stopped by once a week to clean the place up. It wasn't falling apart or infested with pests or anything. It was technically a sort of halfway home years and years ago, and it had to be shut down when some man was found dead of heroin overdose on the front steps. It eventually reopened to the public again, and some of the people who lived there previously had nowhere else to go and moved back in. At this point of the story, I was a really broke college kid. I got some really weird vibes from the place, but I was really short on money, and I thought it would be an interesting experience, to say the least. Well, I wasn't wrong. First of all, it looked like the architect had actually gleaned inspiration from The Shining. Long, narrow hallways, some straight and some swooping around. Some that started out normal and then got so narrow that you literally had to walk sideways to fit. There was painted over doors and doors that led to nowhere, and tiny doll-sized doors in the hallway that never opened. There were a lot of creepy pictures of crying girls or off-putting abstract paintings decorating the walls. My friend lived in a small room that had a large mysterious X painted over his bed. He also had a painted over locked door to his left. And my other friend who lived on the second story at the end of the building had a window that looked out of a straight-up brick wall. Pretty bizarre, right? Well, wait until you meet your neighbors. Schizophrenics and drugged-out zombies wandered up and down the halls or peeked out of their doors before slamming it shut. You could just be walking along when the door would suddenly open and a battered-looking woman would tell you that the other tenants were trying to hurt her and that she was going to be sleeping with a knife for protection. Another good friend of mine once opened her door and found an entire lamp taken apart piece by piece and then aligned on her doorstep. There's a few incidents that really stick out in my mind. Once I went to the shattered kitchen to make myself lasagna. One of the women was already there and she was sitting in a kitchen chair just talking to herself in a high-pitched girly voice. Now, this woman was a big and rather imposing individual, made all the more intimidating because she had a habit of ramming people in the shoulder whenever she passed them in the halls. She's just sitting there and mocking and insulting me the entire time, but all to herself as if I can't hear her, all while eyeing me with a sideways, dead-eyed kind of look. Every now and then she gives a high-pitched giggle that sounded truly sinister. Well, I then say, everything all right? And she's muttering to herself, "The thing's talking to me." I won't respond. And then she giggles. I'm definitely perplexed at this point. I pick up a fork and I'm getting ready to exit, and she then starts really flipping out and starts rapidly saying,
You got a fork? You gonna kill me with that? You gonna stab me in the throat and murder my family with that fork? Yes, she was actually screaming by the end of it. I didn't stick around. I could still hear her screaming whenever I would take my crap out of the door, going on about hurting her. And just like some movie, I can hear high-pitched hysterical laughter echoing down the halls as she gets louder and louder. Truly brought goosebumps up to my arms, I can tell you that. Another time, a man was so messed up on some substances that he could hardly stand, and he tried to chase me. He was at the foot of the stairs and I had to pass him, and he tried to slur some nonsense at me while I walked by him. I think he said something about a shower. Well, he reaches out and grabs my arm and then tries pulling me toward him. I pull away so fast that he gets knocked over, and as I'm running up the stairs, he's trying to collect himself and stand back up. I hide in my friend's room and we can hear him slouching and banging up the stairs, just calling for me in a doped up sort of way. About a week later, he apparently forgets about it and I see him in the lobby. He had asked me which room I lived in. So yeah, that's a brief summary of the really creepy place that I lived in at one point. It was definitely an interesting and creepy experience, to say the least. For some context, I'm a 23-year-old female, but at the time of this story I was 19 years old and in my second semester of college. The college that I went to was in Monterey Bay, California. It was a big campus, but most of the students were all spread out throughout the buildings. At the time, I lived on campus in the dorms that were located in the middle of campus where all the freshmen lived. I had just finished my anthropology class with my friend and we were walking back to our dorms. She lived in the hall right across from mine. They were separated by 2 doors and stairs on the 3rd floor, so eventually we would split off. Each door can only be unlocked with the student ID of those who live in the building. This is important for later. We were approaching our building when a man had started yelling for us to stop. We waited, but we had kept an eye on him while we watched him approach. I'm a bit of an uneasy person whenever I meet new people, so I always size up people that I meet. This man was slender and short, but slightly taller than me, with dark, messy brown hair and black circles under his eyes. He seemed off to me, so I remained cautious. He didn't have any books or a backpack on him, but he was holding a clipboard with a pencil. He started saying that he was approaching girls with a study he was conducting, that when someone is experiencing a loss, they can then feel better when they get the numbers of pretty women. Now, I'm a psychology major, so I kinda just laughed it off in my head. We both said sorry and no thanks, but he kept on persisting. Again we said no, but this time we actually mentioned that we both had boyfriends, so we didn't feel okay about it. I turned away a bit slower than my friend. As we began to walk away, his face turned to anger, and he actually reached to grab my friend's arm. Now the thing to know here is not only am I uneasy around strangers, but anytime I go anywhere I always have a pocket knife on me. It didn't take me very long to flick it out at the guy when I then stood in between him and my friend. The surprised look on his face told me that he didn't expect one of us to get defensive about him grabbing us, but he still just stood there watching me. I then told my friend to run to the stairs. It didn't take her long to get to the top, and she had her keycard fully ready to unlock her door. I told him if he followed either of us, I wouldn't hesitate to use my knife on him. I slowly backed away and then bolted up the stairs. He took a few steps towards the stairs, but I had my card out and I was already inside the hall before he could do anything, and so was my friend. When I finally got into my dorm room, I slid down my door and then just shook for about 15 minutes. I eventually made my way to class and I explained everything that happened to my professor. She told me to email my RA and have my friend do the same. After class was over, I went straight to my room and sent the email. My friends and I decided from that day on that we would always walk together everywhere. Nobody went anywhere alone. 2 days later, there was a school-wide email alert. The guy that had confronted us wasn't even a student at all. he had apparently been stalking girls to their dorms and then trying to get into their rooms. University police were looking for him, but to my knowledge, he was never found. I never went anywhere on campus alone without a knife, and my friend got pepper spray so that if I wasn't there, she had something to defend herself. I don't want to even imagine what would have happened if I wasn't prepared, or if either of us was alone. I just don't want to think about it.
I'm 18, and I just recently moved out of my parents' house to go to an out-of-state college in California. Now, my flight flew in a few days before the school dorms actually opened, so me and a few friends thought it would be fun to rent an Airbnb until then. So we did just that. We bought the cheapest one we could find, as we were just broke college kids. On the first day when we arrived, I couldn't help but notice how sketchy the area was. You could easily tell we weren't in the best part of town, but I guess that's what we get for buying the cheapest option. It was the second night, and all my friends went to a nearby house party, though I decided not to go, as I had a pretty bad headache and didn't feel like doing much. So I was left home alone. It was around 9 p.m., and I was just coming out of the bathroom when I heard the front gate to the yard swing open. I saw someone run past the porch window and into the backyard. From what I could see, it looked like a deranged guy hunched over wearing all black. In reaction, I ran to the window facing the backyard, but I didn't see anyone. Though I never saw the guy return, which meant he must have been somewhere in my backyard. I stood there looking out the backyard window for a good few seconds when I heard a knock on the front door. I jumped in reaction, but walked over to see a pretty normal-looking dude in his 40s. I went right up to the security bars, and the guy proceeded to ask me if I'd seen his son. I replied saying, "Yeah, I think so. I just saw someone go into the backyard." He responded saying his son ran away, and he'd been following him trying to catch up to him. It struck me as weird though, as the first guy didn't look much younger than the second. I thought there was no chance he was this guy's son. The guy walked off towards the backyard before I could question it though. I waited by the front door for a bit, until I saw both of the guys fidgeting with the door in the back. I went up to ask what they were doing, and they stopped for a second, and just replied with, "Hey man, my son really has to use the bathroom. Could you unlock this door and let us in?" The guy stood there staring at me, dead in the eyes, waiting for my response. I told him no, as these guys really gave me an off vibe. And that's when the second guy threw his whole body at the front door in an attempt to break it down. I jumped back in response, and ran upstairs to grab my phone to call the police. I stayed up there till they arrived, though the two men were gone when the police arrived. The two officers proceeded to tell me that 2 other break-ins were reported in that area not even an hour ago. I never knew if they ended up catching the 2 guys. It's likely that the first guy ran into the backyard to try to find a way in the house, and the second guy went to help him. What disturbs me most is the fact that they didn't want to break in just to rob the place. They weren't even scared off by the fact that someone was home. They clearly wanted me to open the door so that they could get inside and do who knows what.
In my freshman year of high school, during the first semester, I had a civics class as my last class of the day. The school that I went to was pretty average size, I would say. I remember the class that I was in had about 20 kids in it. It was a couple of months into the school year at this point, and on this Thursday afternoon, we were all just listening to the teacher go through some announcements, when suddenly the phone in the classroom rang. The teacher, Mrs. Lindstrom, walked over and answered it. Then she hung up and told us all that the school was going under a lockdown. She seemed pretty serious and told us that this was not a drill. She locked her classroom door and then turned out the lights and instructed us to the back end of the classroom. We all got up from our desks and went to the back. There was a lot of whispering going on, but nobody seemed to know why we were under a lockdown. The longer we all sat back there, the more concerned everyone seemed to get, which made me start to worry. I started thinking of all the possibilities of what could be going on. It got really quiet after a while, and at one point we heard footsteps going down the hallway, but we didn't know whose they were. The lockdown went on for probably 30 more minutes before there was another call to the classroom announcing that the lockdown had been ended. We returned to class for the final 15 minutes or so, but the only thing on my mind was what could have caused it. School was dismissed after that, and I left school to get on my bus. When I got outside the school, I noticed several police cars with flashing lights. Everyone was talking about the lockdown, and I heard several rumors about what it was, but But it wasn't until later that night where I got the real answer. My friend Robbie, whose mother worked at the school, told me that the lockdown had been caused by a student who claimed to see a strange man wandering the halls. However, after an extensive search of the school, one of the back doors was seen to be open, and it was determined that the man had left. The area was briefly searched, but the man was never found. The next day, when I went back to school, everything seemed to be pretty normal, and by the time I got to third hour, I had forgotten all about what had happened the day before. It was a Friday, so I was pretty much just excited to go to the football game that night. In the middle of my third hour class, which was history, I had to go to the bathroom. I knew the teacher was one of the nicer ones who didn't require a pass or anything, so I just asked and she allowed me to go. I walked down the halls of the bathrooms, which are towards the end. As soon as I opened the door and got inside, I came face to face with a man who I had never seen before. He was wearing a winter hat and had long black hair and a small beard. He looked really surprised to see me. We both stood there staring at each other for a second or two. Then the man came towards me and I turned and ran. I ran back to class. When I got back, I told my teacher what I had seen, and the school once again went on another lockdown. This time we stayed locked down for over an hour. I was terrified, but finally it ended, and afterwards everyone was allowed to go home early. They told us the man had finally been caught, but what I don't understand is how they didn't find him the first time the school was locked down, and what he was doing inside there in the first place.
I went to high school with a guy, Bob. Bob and I were never close, but we sometimes hung out in the same circle. He was in band and I was in drama. Bob was always a little off. I think he may have had a learning disability and maybe that resulted in him being socially awkward. Anyway, by sophomore year he was dating a friend of mine, so I saw more of him. By junior year he dropped out and tried to get his GED. That was the last I heard of Bob, for a while at least. Fast forward to the summer 2 years after graduating. Bob calls me up out of the blue and asks me to go camping with him and a friend of his that I don't know. He says that he knows a spot that is totally secluded and that we would be hiking 5 miles a day. He really tries to sell me on this. He insists that it'll be awesome and fun and that we'll bond. As I listen to him, something from the pit of my stomach says, no, don't do this. Never being especially close to him and not having seen him for 2 years, I thought that it was weird for Bob to call me up, and I declined his offer. The following November, Bob is on the news because he had killed his partner. He worked for an armored van service and stolen the money in the armored van. There were news updates about him fleeing out of the state. He was finally caught on a routine traffic stop, I believe. Anyway, when his case went to trial, his journal was entered into evidence. The prosecutor said that Bob wrote that he and his friend, the same one that was going to go camping, hatched a plan to become professional assassins. I believe that the camping trip he invited me on was all a ruse so that he could get me in a secluded place so that he and his friend could practice how to murder someone, namely me.